But a major, major theme in his overall political economy is summarized in the phrase, the primacy of politics over economics. And without even elaborating on that, you can probably guess what that's all about. All the way back in Mein Kampf, Hitler criticized the idea, and now these are his words, that the state is first of all a business institution, is to be governed according to business interests, and therefore also depends on business for its continued existence. Politics is supreme over economics. And this makes sense in the general scheme of fascism, whether it's in its Italian or German form. Because when we think about what are the ideas motivating fascism, well, a lot of it came about right around the time of World War I and the aftermath of World War I. People looked around Italy, let's say, and Italy was, still had quite noticeable regional differences. But during the war, there was this sense that whether you were Sicilian or, a Lombard or Piedmontese or whatever, everybody had come together in a single national effort. And that this was, kind of reviving the Italian people in really exciting and momentous ways. And so in peacetime, we need to have that same kind of commitment to organization and maybe the suppression of regional differences, but playing up the idea of Italian unity once more. And when you think about and to think of the state, moreover, as this vehicle, almost a divine vehicle through which the destiny of the people unfolds, well, business seems so mundane, seems so pedestrian compared to the realization of our great destiny as a people. So, in reflecting that, we have Hitler saying, business does not build states. The political forces built states. Well, I'm glad they admit it. Business can never replace the political force, and if a nation does not possess political force, its economy will collapse. Business is more burdening than uplifting. Today, you see many Germans, especially in middle-class circles, who always say business will forge our nation together. No, business is a factor which is more likely to sunder a nation. A nation has political ideals, but if a nation only lives for business, business must thereby sunder a nation because in business, employers and employees always oppose each other. But you see, when we think about more elevated things rather than the mundane world of buying and selling, these class distinctions fall away. See, we're all Germans now. We don't have to think about those things that divide us. He said that the rule of force of the economically more powerful is to be replaced by the higher interests of the community. Again, a major theme, that the public good, which will be defined by the state, that's one of these slippery words that sometimes conservatives want you to accept. The public good, the public good. Who gets to define the public good? The sociopaths who tax me? Yeah, no thanks. And we need to subordinate that, or we need to subordinate your individual interests to the public good, which we will define. Well, that's his view, and that's the view of every social democrat. He says, all the gigantic tasks which not only the economic needs of the present show us, but also a critical look into the future can only be completed if over the egoistic mind of the individual, the speaker for the interests of the community holds sway, and his will counts as the final decision. We see this, to some degree he acknowledges that you need business, but it's got to be absolutely subordinate to the political power. And in a minute, we'll see his view that if you don't do what I ask you to do, then I'll even take over that. So, in fact, at one point, Hitler says, our socialism goes much deeper than theirs. Because, in effect, he says, who needs to nationalize the factories and the banks if we socialize the people? If they do everything I ask them to do, then I don't need to take them over. In fact, he says, I'll quote that later, as long as you guys do everything I say, you can keep your stuff. But to what extent is it still your stuff if you have to do everything he says? I wouldn't ask that question at that time if I were you. But even in the realm of architecture, here's a spooky passage. He in effect says that if your skyline just shows hotels and office buildings and things of this sort, again, how mundane. You cannot speak of art or culture. We need the state to build up big, beautiful buildings. So he says, It is impossible to give a nation a strong inner security if the large public buildings do not tower greatly over the works which owe their creation and maintenance more or less to the capitalist interests of individuals. Are you getting the idea this guy is anti-capitalism to some degree? And yet, isn't it hysterical that we get called terrible names? We are so far from this, right? So then he says, it is out of the question to bring the monumental buildings of the state or the movement into a size which equates to that of 2 or 3 centuries ago, while on the other hand, the expressions of bourgeois creations in the area of private or even purely capitalist building have increased and grown bigger many times over. As long as the vistas which characterize our cities today have department stores, markets, hotels, office buildings in the form of skyscrapers and so forth as their outstanding eye-catchers, there can be no talk of art or even of genuine culture. And he says, during the bourgeois era, the architectural embellishment of public life was held back in favor of the objects of private capitalist business life. The great cultural historic task of National Socialism will be exactly to depart from this tendency. And then a few other quotations just to solidify the point. One of the most urgent tasks, he says, to achieve our goals, it can be broken down into 2 points. State interest goes before private interest. Number 2, if the question arises between state interest and private interest, it will be decided in favor of the state interest, you know that, and by an authority which is completely independent. I'm sure that'll be completely independent. He says, the view, now this is kind of like you didn't build this. You didn't build that. He says, the view that the utilization of a fortune, no matter of what size, is solely the private affair of the individual, requires to be corrected all the more in the National Socialist state. Because without the contribution of the community, no individual would have been able to enjoy such an advantage. So you didn't really earn that. Oh, how about that? Now, if I'd quoted that, you know, there's a funny YouTube video of some kid who went to some like progressive rally, and he took some Hitler quotations like this, and he started just shouting them through a bullhorn, and these idiots are all clapping. Yeah, we're sick and tired of the state not sticking it to these people. But now we get to this idea that I'm going to step in if necessary. The right to dispose completely freely of that which must be invested in the interest of the national community, well, we can't say that an individual has that. If he disposes of his property in a sensible manner, all the better. If he does not act sensibly, then the National Socialist state intervenes. Guess who gets to define what constitutes sensibly? Indeed. Now, it's hard to know the full scope of Hitler's views before 1933 because he went out of his way to be secretive about them so as not to offend businessmen. And he made that clear to some of his colleagues that we have to keep this quiet because then, you know, we don't want to be actively opposed by powerful forces. So he says, what I have said all along is that this idea is not to become a subject for propaganda or even for any sort of discussion except within the innermost study group. It can only be implemented in any case when we hold political power in our hands. And even then, we will have as opponents, besides the Jews, all of private industry, particularly heavy industry, as well as the medium and large landholders, and naturally the banks. Now, if it were really true, as the communists try to claim, that fascism is merely the most developed, like degenerate form of capitalism, why would he fear that he would be opposed by private industry, heavy industry, medium and large landholders, and the banks? It's almost like the communists don't understand fascism at all. He says, again privately, we are living, this is 1930, we are living in the middle of a turnabout, which is leading from individualism and economic liberalism to socialism. And again, in all of business, in all of life, in fact, all of life, we will have to do away with the concept that the benefit to the individual is what is most important, and that from the self-interest of the individual, the benefit to the whole is built up. The opposite is true. The benefit to the community determines the benefit to the individual. The profit of the individual is only weighed out from the profit of the community. If this principle is not accepted, then an egoism must necessarily develop, which will destroy the community. I always get a kick out of it when politicians talk about egoism. Like, well, I guess you would know. He says that the job of the Ministry of Economics is to present the tasks of the national economy, and then the private economy will have to fulfill them. If the private sector doesn't comply, we read this, then the National Socialist state will know how to solve these tasks. Ooh, kind of chilling. So in Hitler's mind, there are two competing doctrines fundamentally at work. Now, number one is this idea of the primacy of politics over economics. On the other hand, for a long time, competing against that in his mind is the idea that there is something to be valued in laissez-faire, and that is the idea of economic competition, because he believes economic competition can be a mainspring for economic growth and progress. And moreover, being a social Darwinist, he thinks that competition is really how greatness comes about, and the great are rewarded and the not so great are not rewarded. And so the total nationalization of the economy, he thinks, would unduly suppress these salutary features. But as time goes on, it becomes clear that the primacy of politics over economics is really coming more to the forefront of his thinking, and his hesitations about nationalization are diminishing gradually.